I knew the HOA in my neighborhood was bad, but I didn't know they were this bad. That was until I walked out to my truck one morning and found all 4 tires completely deflated. Not slashed, just flattened, like someone had deliberately let the air out of them. At first, I thought maybe it was some punk kids messing around, but then I saw the bright orange violation sticker plastered on my driver's side window. Illegal parking. Vehicle subject to tow. Illegal parking? In my own lot? I owned the entire parking lot. I stared at the sticker, then at my deflated tires, then back at the notice. My blood started boiling. That's when I heard her voice. Well, maybe next time you'll follow the rules. I turned and saw Theresa Whitmore, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, standing on the sidewalk with her arms crossed. Mid-50s, an ever-present scowl, and a clipboard clutched in one hand like it was a weapon. "Did you do this?" I asked, pointing at my tires. She sniffed. "I don't know what you're talking about, Bradley. Don't play dumb, Theresa. You put this violation on my truck, and now my tires are flat. What kind of power trip are you on?" Theresa shrugged. "Parking is for residents only, not freeloaders. You should be grateful I didn't have it towed." I let out a sharp laugh. "Freeloader? Theresa, did you even bother checking property records before you pulled the stunt?" She narrowed her eyes. "I don't need to check records. The HOA has authority over all common areas, right? And that would be a problem for me if this were actually a common area. But it's not." I folded my arms. "I own this entire parking lot, Theresa. Bought it when I purchased my property. It's on my deed." For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed her face. "That's not possible." "It is. And if you'd bothered to fact-check before pulling this nonsense, you would have known that." Theresa recomposed herself and huffed. "Regardless, you still need to follow the HOA's parking rules." "No, I don't." My voice was steady, but my patience was wearing thin. "This lot isn't under the HOA's jurisdiction. It's private property. My private property. And that means you just vandalized my truck for no reason." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You're mistaken, and if you have a problem, take it up with the board." I took a slow, deep breath. "Oh, trust me, Theresa. I will." I wasn't wasting any time. As soon as Theresa stomped off, I pulled out my phone and called a tow truck to reinflate my tires. While I waited, I marched back inside and grabbed a folder from my desk, the one that held all the legal documents for my property, including the deed. If Theresa wanted to challenge me, I was going to hit her with hard facts. By the time the tow truck arrived, a few of my neighbors had started gathering around, whispering among themselves. Nobody in this neighborhood particularly liked the HOA, but most people were too afraid of retaliation to openly challenge them. That was about to change. The tow truck driver got my tires reinflated in no time, and I handed him a generous tip before turning my attention back to the growing crowd. "Did anyone see what happened to my truck?" I asked. A few people hesitated before an older man named Frank spoke up. "I saw Theresa and that weasel Todd sneaking around earlier. They were messing with something near your tires, but I didn't think much of it at the time." Todd. That made sense. He was another HOA board member, Theresa's little lapdog. If Theresa told him to jump, he'd ask how high. I nodded. That's all I needed to hear. With my paperwork in hand, I headed straight for the HOA's so-called office. It was really just a repurposed clubhouse, but Theresa treated it like her personal empire. As I expected, she was inside, sitting behind a desk like she was some kind of CEO. Todd hovered nearby, looking smug until he saw me walk in. "Bradley," Theresa said, feigning surprise. "I didn't think you'd come so soon." I dropped my folder onto her desk. "I'm here to settle this right now. You vandalized my truck under the false claim that I was illegally parked. Here's my deed, clearly stating that I own the entire parking lot. You had no authority to issue me a violation, and you definitely had no right to tamper with my vehicle." Theresa barely glanced at the papers before pushing them aside. "The HOA has a right to enforce community guidelines, not on private property." I jabbed a finger at the deed. "This lot isn't part of the HOA's jurisdiction. You overstepped, and now you're going to make it right." Todd scoffed. "You're making a big deal out of nothing. Just pay the fine and move on. I let out a dry laugh. Oh, I'm not paying a dime. In fact, you and Theresa are going to reimburse me for the tow truck fees. And if you don't, I'll be filing a police report for vandalism and harassment. Theresa's expression faltered, but she recovered quickly. You wouldn't dare. Try me. I pulled out my phone. I've got a witness who saw you and Todd messing with my truck. One call and the cops will have a nice vandalism case to investigate. Might even get you for attempted fraud since you tried to fine me under false pretenses. Todd shifted uncomfortably, but Theresa wasn't ready to back down. This is absurd. The HOA. I cut her off. The HOA has no authority over my property. You keep pushing this and I'll take legal action. Maybe even a civil suit for damages. How do you think the rest of the board will react when they find out you're dragging them into a lawsuit over your personal vendetta? That finally made her hesitate. She wasn't worried about the legality, she was worried about losing her grip on power. After a long silence, she exhaled sharply. Fine. The violation is voided, and we'll reimburse your fees. Put it in writing. Theresa's jaw clenched, but she scribbled out a quick statement and handed it over. I read it carefully before tucking it into my folder. Pleasure doing business with you, I said before walking out. As I stepped back outside, I saw Frank and a few other neighbors waiting. When I gave them a nod, Frank grinned. About time someone put her in her place, he said. I had a feeling this was just the beginning. The storm wasn't over. If anything, I had only fired the first shot. Theresa might have backed down in the moment, but she wasn't the type to let something like this go. That became obvious the very next morning when I walked outside to find a brand new violation taped to my front door. Unauthorized business activity, cease immediately or face further action. I let out a low breath, forcing myself to stay calm. The accusation was ridiculous. I didn't run a business from my home. I worked construction, but all my contracts were off-site. The only thing on my property was my personal equipment and truck, which, as established, were parked on my own private lot. Theresa was testing me, seeing if I would cave under pressure. She was about to learn a hard lesson. I pulled the paper off my door and made my way toward the HOA office. I wasn't going to waste time playing games. When I stepped inside, I found Theresa and Todd once again occupying their usual spots, Theresa behind the desk, Todd hovering like a guard dog who had no bite. Theresa barely looked up. If you're here to argue, Bradley, I suggest you save your breath. The violation stands. I placed the paper on the desk, tapping it once. Explain this. Todd scoffed. It's clear as day. You're conducting business from your home, which is against HOA regulations. I tilted my head slightly. You're going to have to be more specific. What business, exactly, do you think I'm running? Theresa folded her hands. We've received multiple complaints about the excessive presence of work vehicles and equipment on your property. That suggests commercial activity. I leaned forward, lowering my voice just enough to make them uneasy. You mean my personal truck and tools? You know, the ones I use for my job. Todd crossed his arms. Doesn't matter. The HOA has rules against storing commercial equipment in a residential area. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my files until I landed on exactly what I needed. I checked the bylaws last night, just for fun. There's no rule against homeowners keeping personal work vehicles on their own property. What you're trying to cite applies only if someone is running a business that brings customers in and out of the neighborhood. Which I'm not. Theresa's lips thinned. There's room for interpretation. I let out a breath through my nose, amused. No, there isn't. You're making up violations now, Theresa. That's harassment. Todd shifted, clearly uncomfortable with where this was going. Theresa, however, wasn't ready to admit defeat. We have the authority to determine what is and isn't appropriate for the community. I locked eyes with her. No, you don't. Not when it comes to my private property. And if you don't rescind this violation right now, I'll be forced to escalate this. You already vandalized my truck. Now you're fabricating complaints. At this rate, I might have to take legal action for a pattern of harassment. For the first time, I saw doubt flicker in Theresa's eyes. She knew I wasn't bluffing. Todd cleared his throat. Maybe we should revisit this with the rest of the board. Theresa shot him a glare, but I could see the realization sinking in. She wouldn't win this fight. Not legally. not without serious consequences. With a sharp sigh, she snatched the violation notice from her desk and tore it in half. Fine. Consider it rescinded. But don't push your luck, Bradley. I smiled. Oh, don't worry, Theresa. My luck's just getting started. I turned and walked out, satisfied that I had won yet another battle. But I knew this wasn't over. Theresa wasn't the type to give up so easily. If she had already resorted to blatant lies, it was only a matter of time before she tried something worse. I needed to be ready for whatever came next. I knew Theresa wouldn't let things go, but I hadn't expected her to escalate so quickly. The next morning, I woke up to an official-looking envelope stuck to my front door. It was a formal notice from the HOA, demanding that I either donate my parking lot to the community or face an eminent domain review. I stood there, reading the paper over twice, my jaw tightening with every word. This was a new level of audacity. She was now trying to forcefully claim my private property under the guise of community necessity. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Frank, my retired neighbor who had been keeping a close eye on the HOA's antics, came strolling up with a cup of coffee in hand. They're getting desperate, he said, nodding at the letter. I exhaled through my nose. She's out of her mind if she thinks she can pull this off. Frank chuckled. She's banking on you not knowing your rights. That was her first mistake. I wasn't just some clueless homeowner. I had already spent the past couple of nights researching HOA overreach cases, and I knew for a fact that an HOA had no power to claim eminent domain. That was a government process, and even then, it required a legal battle that Theresa was in no position to win. I tucked the letter under my arm and walked straight to the HOA office. The door was unlocked, and inside, I found Theresa and Todd sitting at the same desk, looking far too pleased with themselves. Theresa folded her hands and tilted her chin up. I assume you received our notice. I tossed the paper onto the desk. I did. And I assume you know this is completely illegal. Todd sat forward. You're being unreasonable, Bradley. The community needs that lot for overflow parking. It benefits everyone. I narrowed my eyes. Funny, because up until now you claimed I wasn't even allowed to park there. Now suddenly it's a community necessity. Theresa pursed her lips. Circumstances change. I crossed my arms. The only thing that's changed is that you realized you can't fine me or harass me into submission. So now you're trying to steal my land outright. Theresa scoffed. It's not stealing. We're offering a fair solution. If you donate the lot, we'll waive all future HOA fees. I let out a short laugh. I don't owe HOA fees. My property isn't part of your jurisdiction. Remember? Todd's smirk faltered, and Theresa's hands clenched slightly. I continued, my voice calm but firm. Let's get one thing straight. An HOA cannot invoke eminent domain. That's a government process, and even if the city wanted to take my property, they'd have to compensate me at market value and go through years of legal red tape. You have no claim here. Theresa's nostrils flared. You're being selfish, Bradley. This is about the community. I leaned forward slightly. No, this is about control. You tried to fine me, that failed. You tried to harass me, that failed. Now you're grasping at straws. But here's the thing, Theresa, I'm not just going to sit back and take this. I'm going to make sure every homeowner in this neighborhood knows exactly what kind of scam you're running. Todd shifted uncomfortably. There's no need to make this public. Oh, I absolutely will. I pulled out my phone. In fact, I think I'll start a petition to have the HOA board reviewed by the community. Maybe even vote on new leadership. Theresa's face hardened. You wouldn't dare. I raised an eyebrow. Watch me. I turned and walked out, already drafting my plan in my head. If Theresa wanted a war, she was about to get one. The moment I stepped out of the HOA office, I knew I had to act fast. Theresa was already losing ground, but she wasn't the type to go down quietly. If she felt her hold on the neighborhood slipping, she'd lash out in ways I hadn't even anticipated yet. I made a beeline for Frank's house, knowing he was the best ally I could have in this fight. He had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years, had seen multiple HOA boards come and go, and unlike most of the residents, he wasn't afraid of Theresa's intimidation tactics. Frank was already waiting on his porch, sipping his coffee like he had all the time in the world. That bad, huh? He said as I approached. Worse. They're trying to claim eminent domain over my lot, I said, handing him the letter. Frank took one look at it and let out a sharp whistle. That's bold even for Theresa. She's desperate. Yeah, but she's also dangerous. If she's willing to pull something this blatantly illegal, what's next? Frank set his coffee down and rubbed his jaw. You're right to be worried. When people like her start losing control, they don't back off. They double down. I nodded. That's why I need to get ahead of this. I'm starting a petition to get the HOA board reviewed, maybe even voted out. But I need people to back me up. Frank grinned. You've got me. And I know a few others who'd be happy to sign. That was all I needed to hear. We spent the next hour drafting a petition, outlining every overreach, every bogus fine, and every shady action Theresa had taken in the past year alone. By the time we were done, we had a solid case for why the board needed to be held accountable. Then we hit the pavement. Going door to door wasn't easy. Some neighbors were too scared to sign, afraid of retaliation. Others were indifferent, convinced that no one could take on the HOA and win. But there were plenty who were just as fed up as I was. People who had been fined for ridiculous reasons, harassed over minor infractions, or bullied into compliance. One by one, the signatures added up. By the end of the day, we had nearly half the neighborhood on board. That was more than enough to trigger a formal review of the HOA board under the community's bylaws. Theresa wasn't going to see this coming. That night, I sent an official notice to the HOA demanding a special meeting to discuss the petition. According to the bylaws, they couldn't refuse. The board was obligated to address any petition that had the backing of at least 30% of the homeowners. I knew the moment Theresa saw it, she'd lose her mind. And I was ready for it. The special HOA meeting was set for the following Friday, and the tension in the neighborhood was thicker than ever. Word of the petition had spread like wildfire, and people were talking in hushed voices on their porches, exchanging knowing looks whenever Theresa walked by. She had tried to keep a tight grip on the situation, but the cracks in her control were widening. By the time Friday evening rolled around, the clubhouse was packed. More residents than I had expected showed up, some standing against the walls when all the chairs were filled. Frank sat near the front, arms crossed, watching everything unfold like an old gunslinger waiting for a duel. Theresa sat at the head of the room, her usual clipboard in front of her, lips pressed into a thin line. Todd was beside her, looking uneasy, and the two other board members, Lisa and Greg, sat stiffly, clearly unsure of how this was going to play out. I stood near the entrance, petition in hand. When the murmuring died down, Theresa cleared her throat. This meeting has been called under unusual circumstances, she began, voice strained but steady. Certain members of the community have taken it upon themselves to question the integrity of this board without proper cause. A few people scoffed. Someone in the back muttered something under their breath, earning a few chuckles. I stepped forward before she could try spinning this any further. Theresa, let's not waste time pretending this is unwarranted. We gathered the required signatures, and under the HOA bylaws, this board is now subject to review by the homeowners. That means we get to discuss your actions and decide whether you're still fit to serve. Her fingers tightened around her clipboard. This is nothing more than a personal attack. Frank leaned forward, voice calm but firm. No, this is about accountability. The HOA exists to serve the community, not the other way around. And lately, it seems like you've forgotten that. Lisa shifted uncomfortably but didn't speak. Greg looked like he wanted to disappear. Todd, for once, had nothing to say. I placed the petition on the table. Let's get right to it. The first issue, the illegal fine you tried to slap on me for parking in my own lot. Theresa straightened. You were in violation. You knew I wasn't. That property isn't under HOA jurisdiction, which you would have realized if you had bothered to check before trying to punish me for something that wasn't against any rule. A few people muttered in agreement. Someone near the back said they had been fined for similar nonsense. I continued, voice steady. Then, when that didn't work, you had my tires deflated. Theresa's jaw twitched. There's no proof of that. Frank gestured toward a few people in the crowd. Actually, multiple neighbors saw you and Todd near Bradley's truck that morning. And let's not forget that conveniently placed violation notice taped to his window immediately after. Todd shifted in his seat. We were just doing routine inspections. Routine inspections don't involve tampering with someone's vehicle. I shot back. Lisa finally spoke, her voice hesitant. Theresa, is this true? Theresa didn't respond, but her silence spoke volumes. I pressed on. Then, after that failed, You tried fabricating a violation about me running a business out of my home. Theresa lifted her chin. Your truck and equipment are all for my personal use and within my rights as a homeowner. You tried to twist HOA rules to suit your agenda. And when that didn't work, you pulled your most ridiculous stunt yet threatening to take my property through eminent domain. A ripple of shock went through the room. Some people gasped. Others started whispering furiously. Lisa turned fully toward Theresa now. You did what? Theresa's face was tight. It was a negotiation tactic. The HOA has the community's best interest in mind. Frank let out a sharp laugh. You mean your best interest? You wanted control over that lot so you could regulate who parks there. You were never thinking about the community. Greg finally spoke, voice quiet but firm. That's overstepping, Theresa. The HOA doesn't have that authority. Todd looked at her, clearly realizing how deep they had gotten. Maybe we should reconsider some of these policies. Theresa's face was red with frustration. She was losing control and she knew it. I turned to the crowd. This is why we're here. This isn't just about me. It's about all of us. How many of you have been fined unfairly? How many of you have been harassed over minor things? How many of you are sick of living under rules that seem to change whenever it suits Theresa? Hands shot up. People started speaking at once. Stories poured out ridiculous fines, threats, warnings for things that weren't even against the rules. The floodgates had opened. Lisa turned to Theresa, her voice firm. I think we need to have a vote. Theresa's eyes flashed with panic. This is absurd. Greg shook his head. No, this is overdue. Lisa took a deep breath and looked at the crowd. All in favor of removing Theresa from the board effective immediately? Hands went up across the room. More than half. Theresa shot to her feet. You can't do this. Greg was already gathering the paperwork. Actually, the bylaws say we can. Todd, seeing the inevitable outcome, stood without a word and hurried out the door. Theresa turned to the crowd, searching for support, but found none. Lisa looked at her, voice calm but final. You're out, Theresa. Pack up your things. For the first time, Theresa had nothing to say. She grabbed her clipboard with shaking hands and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The room was silent for a moment. Then, one by one, people started clapping. Frank turned to me with a grin. Well, that was satisfying. I exhaled, finally letting the tension in my shoulders ease. Yeah, it was. Lisa turned back to the crowd. We'll be holding a vote for a new board member next week. In the meantime, if anyone has concerns they'd like addressed, we're listening. The energy in the room had shifted. For the first time in a long while, people actually felt heard. As I stepped outside, the cool evening air felt lighter. Frank clapped a hand on my shoulder. You really shook things up, kid. I let out a small laugh. Someone had to. Theresa was gone. The neighborhood had won. And for the first time in years, things were finally looking up.